The stiff cream cardstock of the invitation felt alien in my hands. A formal summons to a life I no longer seemed to fully inhabit, my daughter Clara's life. Her wedding. The script was elegant, impersonally so chosen, I was sure, by Andrew's mother, a woman whose taste ran towards the conspicuously expensive and the emotionally sterile. Clara had delivered it herself, a brief, almost perfunctory visit, her eyes darting around my quiet living room as if searching for dust motes or signs of encroaching senility. Then came the carefully rehearsed words that pricked sharper than any needle. "Mother," she began, her voice meticulously neutral, a tone I recognized from her teenage years when she was about to ask for something she knew I'd question. "For the wedding, for my day, I need you to be quiet." She paused, perhaps gauging my reaction, but I kept my face a calm mask, a skill honed over years of loving a daughter who increasingly resembled a stranger. "Just be there, smile. Please don't make a scene. No stories about Dad, no impromptu toasts, nothing like that." Andrew's parents, the Prestons, they're very particular, very traditional. The word traditional felt like a euphemism for judgmental and intolerant of anything that doesn't mirror their own polished image. My late husband, Arthur, her father, would have scoffed. He who loved my stories, who treasured the laughter and the tears that bound our family, would have seen this request not as tradition, but as an erasure. I thought of him then, his warm hand in mine, his booming laugh that could fill a house, his belief that every voice had value, especially the voices of those we loved. Andrew, Clara's intended, was the antithesis of Arthur. I'd only met him a handful of times, a young man sculpted from ambition and surface charm, his eyes always appraising, calculating. Clara seemed to orbit him, reflecting his light, dimming her own. "Of course, dear," I'd said, my voice softer than I intended, the words tasting like ash. "Whatever makes you happy," but inside, a quiet storm was gathering. The request wasn't just about a toast. It was about my presence, my history, my connection to her. It was a demand to be a ghost at my own daughter's celebration. And as she left, a cool peck on my cheek, I felt a stirring, not of immediate anger, but of a deep, resonant sorrow that was slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to crystallize into resolve. There was a truth she was forgetting, a legacy her father had carefully built, a legacy I held in trust, a quiet power she, in her desperate desire to fit into Andrew's world, seemed to have utterly dismissed. The roses in my garden, Arthur's roses, were just beginning to show their tight, promising buds. They would bloom, regardless of the chill in the air. The weeks leading up to the wedding unfurled like a meticulously crafted, yet emotionally barren tapestry. I was a spectator, not a participant. Dress fittings for the bridal party were scheduled without my knowledge. Menu tastings were recounted as amusing anecdotes by Clara, as if I were a distant aunt rather than her mother. When I offered to host a small tea for her older relatives, a tradition in our family, Clara had demurred, citing the Prestons' preference for a large, impersonal rehearsal dinner at their country club. "It's just easier this way, Mother," she'd explained, her gaze fixed somewhere over my shoulder. Less fuss, less connection, I thought. Less heart. Andrew's influence was a silken thread, drawing Clara further into his orbit, his family's expectations becoming her own. Their world was one of appearances, of carefully curated social media posts and strategic alliances, a stark contrast to the simple, profound values Arthur and I had tried to instill. The instruction, "Stay quiet," echoed in the silence of my days. It wasn't just about spoken words, it was about visibility, about acknowledgement. I found myself mentally composing all the things I would not say, the pride I felt when she took her first steps, the comfort I offered when her teenage heart broke, the quiet wisdom her father had shared with her, wisdom she now seemed to discard like an outgrown coat. My old friend, Eleanor Vance, no relation to Arthur, though the shared surname was a gentle irony we both appreciated, my steadfast solicitor and confidant, noticed the shadows under my eyes during one of our regular luncheons. "You're too still, Margaret," she'd said, her gaze sharp but kind. Like a lake before a storm, I offered a wan smile but said little, the habit of quietness already settling upon me. But Eleanor knew me. She knew Arthur. She knew the contours of the legacy he had left, a legacy I was now considering how best to unveil. It wasn't about revenge, not in the sharp, cutting way one might imagine. It was about remembrance, about reintroducing Clara to a truth she had conveniently forgotten, or perhaps had never truly understood. The foundation Arthur had established, a quiet testament to his belief in a gentler, more compassionate world, was more than just money. It was a philosophy, a responsibility. And I, as its steward, had a duty to ensure its voice, if not my own, would be heard. A plan began to form, delicate as a spider's web, strong as steel. The wedding day dawned, a pale, indifferent sun filtering through the lace curtains of my bedroom. I dressed with care, choosing a gown of deep sapphire, a color Arthur had always loved on me, a silent homage to him, a quiet act of defiance against the prescribed neutrality. At the church, a sprawling, ostentatious edifice favored by the Prestons, I was escorted to a pew far from the front, nestled amongst distant cousins and business acquaintances of the groom's family. An usher, clearly briefed, had murmured something about family groupings. I saw Clara glide down the aisle, a vision in white, her face pale and serious, her eyes fixed firmly on Andrew, who stood at the altar, a study in smug satisfaction. I searched for a flicker of recognition, a glance in my direction, but there was none. It was as if I were watching a beautifully staged play. The emotions real for the actors perhaps, but distant and unfelt by me. Beside me, an empty space seemed to hum with a particular kind of silence. It could have been for Arthur, the father who should have been there to give his daughter away. His absence a palpable void. Or perhaps it was a symbol of my own place, the empty chair representing the mother who was present yet invisible, heard yet silenced. The ceremony was flawless, every note from the organ perfectly pitched, every flower artfully arranged. The Prestons in the front pew radiated a proprietary pride. Andrew's mother, a woman whose smile never quite reached her eyes, dabbed delicately at a non-existent tear. It was all so pristine, and so hollow. I thought of Arthur's hands, callous from his work in the garden, yet gentle enough to soothe a crying child. I thought of his laughter, unconstrained and genuine. This polished charade felt a universe away from the authentic life he had championed. The legacy he'd left, the one I carried, was not about grandeur or social standing, but about quiet acts of kindness, about nurturing growth, about making a tangible difference. And the quietness imposed upon me now was not just a personal affront, it was a dismissal of everything he and we had stood for. My silence, however, was no longer passive. It was becoming a vessel gathering strength, preparing for a moment when a different kind of voice would speak. The reception was held at an exclusive club, all glittering chandeliers and hushed, obsequious service. The air hummed with polite conversation and the clinking of champagne flutes. I found my assigned table, again strategically placed on the periphery, a small island in a sea of Preston associates. Clara, now Mrs. Andrew Preston, circulated with her new husband, a fixed smile pinned to her lips. She made a brief stop at my table, her words rushed. "Are you all right, Mother? Enjoying yourself?" The questions were rhetorical, requiring no real answer. Before I could offer more than a polite nod, she was swept away by Andrew, his hand possessively on her arm. The speeches began. Andrew's father, a portly man with an air of self-importance, spoke at length about his son's achievements, the prestige of their family, and welcomed Clara into their distinguished lineage. He made a passing, almost condescending remark about Clara's charming, if somewhat modest, upbringing, a phrase that sent a small cold ripple through me. Modest? If only he knew. If only Clara truly remembered. No one invited me to speak. The master of ceremonies, a slick professional hired by the Prestons, moved through the program with practiced efficiency, announcing the father-daughter dance, the cutting of the cake, each moment another perfectly orchestrated scene. My silence, once a source of pain, now felt like a cloak of invisibility, granting me the freedom to observe, to wait. Eleanor was there, seated at a table with other old family friends. Our eyes met across the crowded room, a brief, understanding glance. The mechanism we had quietly set in motion was ready. It required no grand pronouncements from me, no emotional outbursts. It required only the truth, delivered with precision and quiet dignity. The irony was not lost on me. They had demanded my silence, and in doing so, had created the perfect stage for a far more resonant voice to emerge. Arthur's voice, his legacy, it would speak not of my grievances, but of his enduring values. Values that seemed to have been tragically misplaced in this opulent setting. The weight of his life's work, the quiet compassion that had defined him, felt like a tangible presence beside me, a counterpoint to the superficial glitter surrounding us. Arthur. My Arthur. He had never been a man for the grand gesture, not in the way the world often measures such things. His wealth, accumulated through astute, ethical investments and a lifetime of quiet diligence, was never a source of ostentation. For him it was a tool, a means to an end, and that end was always to make the world a little kinder, a little more just. He'd established the Vance Heritage Foundation, a deliberately unassuming name, decades ago, seeding it carefully, nurturing its growth as he did his beloved roses. He believed in the power of education to unlock potential, in the solace and inspiration of the arts, in the strength of communities that cared for their most vulnerable. These were not abstract ideals for him. They were the bedrock of his existence. Clara knew of an inheritance, of course. She understood she came from comfortable means, a fact that Andrew and his family had undoubtedly assessed and approved. But she perceived it, I think, as a passive pool of money, a safety net, perhaps even a stepping stone into the higher echelons of society she now seemed so eager to join. She did not, or chose not to, understand the active, vibrant entity her father had created, nor the profound responsibility that came with it. She certainly didn't comprehend my role, not fully. Arthur, in his wisdom, had made me the sole lifetime executor and chairwoman of the foundation. "You have the heart for it, Margaret," he'd said, his hand covering mine, his gaze clear and loving. "You understand its soul. You'll know when and how to guide it, and when to let Clara see its true face." He trusted my discretion, my timing. For years I had managed its affairs quietly, channeling its considerable resources into projects that aligned with his vision. Scholarships for underprivileged students, funding for local arts programs, support for community gardens in neglected neighborhoods. It was work that brought me quiet satisfaction, a continuation of my partnership with Arthur, even after he was gone. And now, watching Clara bask in the reflected glory of the Preston name, listening to the hollow pronouncements of status and lineage, I knew the time Arthur had spoken of had arrived. My silence was not just an act of obedience to my daughter's misguided request. It was the deliberate hushing of my own voice to allow his, far more eloquent and enduring, to finally be heard in this arena of shallow ambition. The precise moment of crystallization, the point where quiet sorrow hardened into unwavering resolve, came during the toasts. After Andrew's father had concluded his self-congratulatory monologue, Andrew himself took the microphone. He was flushed with champagne and triumph, his arm draped possessively around Clara's slender shoulders. He spoke of their future, of the empires they would build. A word that grated against the memory of Arthur's quiet philanthropy. Then, with a dismissive wave of his hand, he made a joke about escaping humble beginnings, and finally having a family that understood the finer things in life. He laughed, and a sycophantic titter rippled through his side of the room. Clara smiled, a little too brightly, her eyes avoiding mine, though I felt their fleeting, uncomfortable touch. Humble beginnings. He was referring, of course, to her life with me, with Arthur. He was negating the richness of a childhood steeped not in opulence, but in love, integrity, and a deep appreciation for the true value of things. A value that couldn't be measured in dollars or carats. That was the catalyst. That glib, unthinking cruelty. It wasn't just an insult to me, but a desecration of Arthur's memory, of the very principles upon which our family, our true legacy, was built. I saw with stark clarity how far Clara had drifted, how thoroughly she had absorbed the superficial creed of her new husband and his clan. My silence, so carefully maintained, now felt charged, a coiled spring. I caught Eleanor's eye. She gave a minuscule, almost imperceptible nod. The time was right. The truth, Arthur's truth, would not be shouted in anger or recrimination. It would be presented calmly and factually, a quiet counter-narrative to the loud emptiness of the Preston's world. The poetic justice was almost delicious. They who valued status and wealth above all else were about to be confronted with a form of wealth and status they hadn't even conceived of, one rooted not in acquisition but in giving. My heart, which had ached with a dull sorrow all day, now beat with a steady, purposeful rhythm. The stage was set not by my design but by theirs. They had provided the silence. Arthur would provide the words. The final obligatory speeches had wound down. The band was tuning up for the dancing, and a certain restless energy began to fill the room as guests anticipated the less formal part of the evening. It was then that Eleanor Vance, my dear friend and scrupulous lawyer, rose from her table. She did not stride to the microphone with dramatic flair, nor did she raise her voice to command attention. Instead, she approached the master of ceremonies, who was momentarily disengaged, and spoke to him quietly for a moment. He listened, his expression shifting from polite disinterest to surprise, then to a kind of deferential attentiveness. He nodded, then stepped back to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his professional bonhomie now tinged with a new note of seriousness, "we have one further brief announcement. It comes by way of Ms. Eleanor Vance, legal counsel for the estate of the late Mr. Arthur Morland, father of the bride." A hush fell over the room. Clara's head snapped towards Eleanor, her eyes wide, a flicker of apprehension crossing her face. Andrew looked momentarily confused, then annoyed at this unscheduled interruption. Eleanor walked calmly to the lectern. She was a woman of quiet presence, her silver hair impeccably styled, her demeanor one of understated authority. She carried a single elegant cream envelope. "Thank you," she said, her voice clear and steady, easily carrying through the now silent hall. "On this most significant occasion, the marriage of Clara Morland to Andrew Preston, there is a matter pertaining to the wishes of Clara's late father, Arthur Morland, that I have been entrusted to convey." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. Arthur was a man of foresight and deep affection for his family. He left specific instructions concerning his legacy, some of which were to be shared at a time like this. She carefully opened the envelope and withdrew a letter, not handwritten, but formally typed on what I recognized as the Vance Heritage Foundation's letterhead. "This is not a personal letter from Arthur in the conventional sense," Eleanor clarified, "but rather an official communication from the foundation he established, triggered by this event. As per his directive." She began to read. "To whom it may concern, and most especially to Clara Morland Preston on the occasion of her marriage, the Vance Heritage Foundation, established by Arthur Morland to foster community, education, and the arts, today acknowledges a significant transition. As per the founding charter, upon the marriage of his sole heir, Clara Morland, certain new directives regarding the foundation's focus and governance come into effect. Mr. Morland envisioned his legacy not as a static inheritance, but as a dynamic force for good, evolving with his family and the needs of the world." Eleanor's voice, calm and measured, continued to fill the opulent ballroom, each word landing with the precision of a carefully placed stone in a still pond. "The Vance Heritage Foundation," she read, "currently holds assets dedicated to philanthropic endeavors, a portfolio carefully cultivated over decades by Mr. Morland and subsequently managed by his designated lifetime chairwoman. This is not merely a fund, but a testament to Arthur Morland's profound belief in the interconnectedness of humanity and the responsibility of those with means to contribute to the common good. Its purpose has always been to support those who strive, those who create, and those who care." I watched Clara's face. The initial apprehension had given way to a dawning, stunned comprehension. Andrew, beside her, had lost his smug composure. His jaw was slack, his eyes fixed on Eleanor with an almost predatory intensity, as if trying to calculate the figures involved. Mr. and Mrs. Preston Sr. were frozen, their polite smiles having vanished, replaced by expressions of naked disbelief and something akin to avarice. "The Foundation's primary mission," Eleanor continued, her gaze sweeping briefly over the assembled guests before returning to the letter, "is to disperse its income towards scholarships, artistic grants, community development projects, and initiatives that promote compassion and understanding, causes dear to Arthur Morland's heart. While Clara Morland Preston, as his heir, will naturally be invited to participate in the Foundation's advisory council, should she demonstrate a genuine commitment to its guiding principles, the strategic direction and all fiduciary and disbursement authority remains fully and unequivocally with the lifetime chairwoman, Mrs. Margaret Morland." Her mother. A collective intake of breath seemed to sigh through the room. The mother they had so carefully silenced, the one relegated to the quiet corners, was revealed not as a relic of a humble past, but as the steward of a significant, powerful, and ethically driven financial entity. The letter went on to outline in broad but impressive terms the scope of the Foundation's work, its past achievements, and its ambitious plans for the future, all under my direction. It was Arthur's voice, clear and strong, speaking of values, of purpose, of a wealth far more meaningful than the Prestons could likely comprehend. My silence, the silence they had imposed, was now filled with the thunder of his legacy. I remained seated, my hands resting quietly in my lap, observing the shockwaves ripple across the room. There was no triumph in my heart, only a profound sense of rightness, of a promise kept. The truth in its own time, in its own way, had indeed spoken. The immediate aftermath was a study in social whiplash. The carefully constructed artifice of the Preston wedding, with its emphasis on their own perceived superiority, had been fractured by a truth far more substantial. Andrew's parents were the first to betray their shock, their faces a comical mixture of avarice and thwarted expectation. Mrs. Preston's carefully powdered composure seemed to crack, revealing the grasping ambition beneath. She shot me a look that was no longer dismissive, but sharply speculative, as if seeing me for the first time, not as Clara's quiet mother, but as the controller of an unexpected financial empire, one dedicated to principles they likely found quaint or irrelevant until now. Andrew himself appeared poleaxed. He kept glancing from Eleanor, who was now quietly gathering her papers, to Clara, and then almost furtively to me. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a look of bewildered calculation. What did this mean for him? For his carefully laid plans? Clara was pale, her eyes wide and luminous with unshed tears. She looked utterly lost. A small boat suddenly tossed in a vast, unexpected ocean. The words from the letter, her father's words, her father's legacy, seemed to swirl around her, a truth too large to immediately comprehend. For so long, she had focused on the superficial trappings of Andrew's world, and now the bedrock of her own heritage, a heritage of quiet substance and profound generosity, had been laid bare. Several guests who had earlier offered me polite, distant nods, now approached my table with a newfound, almost fawning respect. They spoke of Arthur with reverence, of the Foundation's noble work, their words a stark contrast to the earlier atmosphere. I received their comments with quiet grace, my demeanor unchanged. This was not my victory, but Arthur's. My role had been to protect his voice until it was time for it to be heard. Clara did eventually approach me, hesitantly, Andrew a shadow at her elbow. "Mother," she began, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't understand. Her eyes searched mine, filled with a complex mix of shame, confusion, and perhaps a dawning awareness. I looked at my daughter, the child I had raised, the woman she was becoming. "There is much to understand, Clara," I said softly, my voice even, devoid of accusation. "Your father left a remarkable legacy. It speaks of his values, his hopes for the world, and for you I offered no easy absolution, no immediate bridging of the chasm that had opened between us. The truth had been spoken. Now it needed time to resonate, to be absorbed, to perhaps change the course of a life." The gilded clock on the ballroom wall chimed, marking an hour that felt both an end and a beginning. The band played on, a little too brightly, trying to recapture the earlier celebratory mood. But the atmosphere was irrevocably altered. The air was thick with unspoken questions, with re-evaluations. I decided it was time for me to leave. My part was played. I rose, and Eleanor, ever observant, was by my side in a moment. There were no grand farewells. I had no desire for the sudden, insincere attentions of the Prestons or their circle. As I walked towards the exit, I passed the main bridal table. Clara was sitting very still, her champagne flute untouched. Andrew was speaking to her in urgent, low tones, gesturing emphatically. She wasn't looking at him. Her gaze was distant, fixed on the elaborate floral centerpiece, or perhaps on something far beyond it. The empty chair that had been beside me earlier, the one that had symbolized Arthur's absence and my own marginalization, now seemed to hold a different kind of presence. It was filled with the weight of his legacy, a silent testament to a life lived with purpose. My quiet departure was not an act of anger or retreat, but one of peaceful disengagement. I had carried Arthur's trust for many years, and tonight I had honored it. His voice, channeled through the formal language of a foundation charter, had spoken more eloquently and powerfully than any personal grievance I might have aired. It had redefined wealth, power, and legacy in a room that had, until that moment, a very narrow understanding of all three. As Eleanor drove me home through the quiet, sleeping streets, A sense of profound calm settled over me. The roses in my garden would be waiting, their fragrance a balm. Arthur's legacy was secure, its future now intertwined with Clara's choices. She had been given not just information, but a profound challenge to understand the true nature of her inheritance, not just its monetary value, but its soul. The truth had indeed spoken, not through my voice, but through the enduring echo of a good man's life. The quiet dignity of that truth was its own most potent vindication. Whether Clara would truly listen, whether she would choose the path of integrity her father had laid out, remained to be seen. But tonight, in the silence he had inadvertently orchestrated, she had been given the map.